Good morning, students. So, we were dealing with the early 20th century England, its social milieu in the last two classes, and now we'll move to the literature of this period. But before that, we will go through a quick recap of what happened in the last two classes. We were talking about the continuity from the Victorian age, the transition towards modernity, how it transformed into a mass democratic and mass consumer society, and how industrialization gave new temper and texture to the society. And then we talked about all those demands of radical reforms, continuous rise of labor movement, rise of feminism and socialism, which were actually continuing from the Victorian period onwards. We talked about the scientific advancement. Of course, it is also a continuous continuing factor from Victorian period. Then we talked about basic social and political issues, also continued from the late Victorian era, and how the empire kept expanding and economy kept ploding, how Britain remained a superpower, dominating seas and holding sway over 400 million people. And in the last class, we were talking about the notes of discontinuity with Victorian era. So Boer War, we talked about Boer War, how it came as an eye opener. They believed they had this passionate spirit of patriotism, which made them believe that it will be over within a matter of weeks, and it went on for over 2.5 years. So from there is something like a sense of decline, and later we see the reactions to the decline, like there is this significant rise in social and industrial protest. We talked about the debate over social, economic, and moral state of the nation. We talked about Foster's and H.G. Wells' work. H.G. Wells actually represented Britain as the most unpremeditated, subtle, successful, and but aimless plutocracy that ever hindered the destinies of mankind. Then we talked about the political evolution. For the first time, we see the rise of Labour Party, and then there comes Great War, and the world changes forever. And we looked into the participation of England in Great War. So it started with the frenzy of patriotism and nationalism, and just like Boer War, here too, they believed that it would be all over by Christmas. It started in August, and they believed that it will be over by Christmas, but it dragged on for around 4 years, which and all their enthusiasm turned into despair. I showed you a small video on trench warfare, and then we talked about the consequences of war, the huge loss of lives, use of poisonous gases, and we dealt with the poetry of Wilfred Owen, in which I gave you hint about how the romantic conception of war was lost in forever in trenches. And the concluding part, we were talking about the war which shook England for the first time. That was the Great War. It was the first instance when British Isle was attacked, and they couldn't recover from the horrors of Great War until the Second World War came. So they believe that this is the greatest disaster happened to them till the Second World War came. Second World War actually completely destroyed their belief. Now we are moving to the war poetry. We are dealing with the poets of the First World War. So, as Perkins says, he says, when the war came to England in 1914, poetry was among the first volunteers. That means poetry was the only form which gave expression to the reality of war, reality of the Great War. So, before that, the early phase of poetry were tried to reflect the idealistic fervor and The war actually had fostered in them an unquestioning enthusiasm for heroic pieties, heroic devotion, and nationalistic feelings. So, poetry written during the early period tried to express a sense of honor and it was written to celebrate the glories of war. So all their poems were deeply patriotic, and it actually made people believe that death is actually a sacrifice which all young men should freely make for the sake of their country. So they had this heroic devotion, passionate spirit of patriotism in them, and it reflected in the first phase of poetry. But as horrors of war increased, nature of poetry also changed. They understood the cruel nature of war, the harsh nature of war, and we see heroism replaced by what Wilfred Owen says the pity of war. So it is said that the poetry of the First World War is primarily a record of the experience of war in conventionally heroic terms till the event itself transformed this traditional response. It says that prime in the first phase it was just a record of the war in a heroic terms with all those patriotic favor. But later the event, the reality of the event, the reality of the war made them change that response, that traditional response, like dying in a battleground is something like giving out your life for the country is something like the greatest thing you can do. So the horrors of war actually changed their attitude towards war. So, poets like Robert Graves, with his Fairies and Fusiliers, which happened in 1917, Nichols came up with Invocation, war poems, and others in 1915, Edmund Blunden, and poets like Julian Grenfell. So, they actually retained a conventional peacetime habit of sensibility. Although it is said that their first hand experience of the war were traumatic, but these experiences didn't find place in their poems. So their experiences is not the focus of their poems. So their poems actually celebrated soldiers' share of the peace and beauty of the natural world amid the havoc brought by the war on fields and farms. So they were actually, though they experienced all those traumas of war, they gave the opposite view in their poems. They actually celebrated the soldiers' life who were in reality dying out there in the battlefield. And the most representative poet is, of course, Rupert Brooke. So it is said that he was the person who recorded a traditional attitude towards war. So we'll look into details. So the first poet here is Rupert Brooke, 1887 to 1950. So he was actually part of Georgian poets. Georgian poets were a group of poets in which all these war poets were also there. So it was a group formed in 1912, and there was this an anthology which was titled Georgian Poetry, and the title was given by the term Georgian was given by the poet Edward Marsh, and Georgian poetry actually depicted depicted all those images of rural England. And as I said earlier, there were all those positive images, and and it lacked what is known as life. So Rupert Brooke belonged to that group of poets. So he was part of Georgian poets at one point, and later he became part of war poetry. So he has written five war sonnets, which actually captured the mood of exaltation in which war becomes the focus for self transcendence. So he had this opening line. His poem, The Soldier, has this opening lines. If I should die, think only this of me, that there is some corner of a foreign world that is forever England. So it is considered to be the best known sonnet and it actually sums up the dedication towards a nation. So it is, as I said earlier, it is a romantic sonnet which is deeply patriotic, and it almost celebrated the values of a liberal culture and his contemporaries, which sees death, as I said earlier, death as a sacrifice which is made for the sake of their own country. But the sad fact is that Rupert Brooke passed away, died because of blood poisoning even before seeing an action. So his other two collections include 1914 and other poems and collected poems which nearly broke records for such a young writer. So later we see the second phase of poetry. So, in the first phase, we were talking about the traditional attitude where they exalted or they demanded the audience to believe that they are giving out their life for the country and it is actually a sacrifice. So that was the first phase. Now we are moving to the second phase. So we see poetry stripping out all those false literary wrappings and entering the real horror of the war, the reality of the war, the harshness of the war, the cruelty of the war. So we have Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, and Wilfred Owen, who brought the horrors of war into poetry. Siegfried Sassoon, 1886 to 1967. So he is best remembered for his angry and compassionate poems about World War One, which brought him public and critical acclaim. So he avoided the sentimentality and the jingoism, the element of patriotism of many war poets, and he wrote about the horror and brutality of trench warfare. And he went on ridiculing, satirizing generals, politicians, and churchmen for the incompetence and blind support of the war. So he has these two poems, The Old Huntsman and Counterattack. Old Huntsman in 1917, Counterattack in 1918, which actually debunked the civilian view of war as redemptive and justified. So these are the lines from Counterattack. Then the haze lifted, bombing on the right, down the old sap. Machine guns on the left, and stumbling figures looming out in front. Oh Christ, they are coming at us, bullets spat. So all his poems try to present. So it is kind of a powerful study on the effects, real effects of war through closely observed details of corpses piled up and rotting in a captured trench. So he started He was the person who started highlighting the soldiers' pathos and self sacrifice, and he also satirized what is known as civilian complacency. And we have the next poet, he's Isaac Rosenberg, 1890 to 1918. So he was an Anglo-Jewish poet, and he was known. He was praised by Siegfried Sassoon as a painter poet. As you see in the picture, it is actually the painter, the poet himself made a portrait of himself. So that is a self-portrait of Isaac Rosenberg. So Sassoon called him a painter poet. So he died in war at the young age of 28, and he brought about the physical and emotional reality of war without any sentiments in his poetry. The immediacies of trench life and the indignity of slaughter are vividly represented in his poems like Break of Day in the Trenches and Dead Man's Dumb. So these are the lines from the poem Break of the Day in the Trenches. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaves my hand, a cure sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Now comes the best representative of war poetry. He is Wilfred Amin, 1893 to 1918. So it is said that perhaps the most valuable contribution to war poetry was made by Wilfred Owen, who at his best wrote more powerfully than any of the poets discussed so far. So Wilfred Owen was actually the first to discard the soothing concept of an England of shining valleys and Arthurian chivalry. So he completely discarded all those romantic or those idealistic concept about England. And his style actually reflected romanticism with the use of parables and visions and the use of subjective lyric and dramatic monologue. But though the style was romantic, the content was not at all romantic. So, as he says, my subject is war and the pity of war. So, the content was always the horrors of war, but the style he used was that of romanticism. And it is said that this element of romanticism, this romantic style, makes his poetry more accessible to the readers and also make his realism more telling, because it is said that romantic diction enables the poet to maintain a certain aesthetic distance from his subject. So he used the romantic style. It should be said that he used romantic style deliberately to make it accessible to the readers, but and his major aim was to take the content, the reality of war into the readers, into the common masses. And it is said that he died in war just a week before the war ended, armistice. Talking about, so I said earlier, he's the best representative of war poetry. So we'll deal with him in a detailed manner. So now we are talking about the style of Wilfred Amin. So it is said that he is a past master of verbal exactitude, verbal accuracy, which we see in Keats. So he used all those Keatsian intensifiers, Keatsian, all those strong expressions used by Keats, and he also employed complex pattern of alliterations and there is this controlled use of assonance. It is said that his poetry actually used all these half assonance, and he also used full rhyme. And he believed that this aspect of poetic form is highly appropriate for the tone and subject matter. The bleak landscape, which is the background of his poetry, found best expression through this poetic form. So he concentrated, I mean, actually concentrated on the immediate sound effects of his poems. So he actually influenced a lot of young poets like Auden, Spender, Macnish, and Ray Lewis. His important poems include Futility, Exposure, Anthem for Doomed Youth, Dulce et Decorum Est. It is actually, I have discussed it earlier, it is line from Latin line from the poem written by Horace, and it means it is sweet and fitting to die. So let's hear. I said that he used all those strong expressions and he used all those sound effects to bring out the horrors of war. So let's look at this poem, his famous poem, Anthem for Doomed Youth.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds.
So, hope you listened to this poem. So you might have understood how we used sounds, strong expressions, which actually gave out the intensity of the war. So, as I said earlier, he actually influenced a number of younger poets, like, as I said earlier, Auden, Spender, Macnish, De Lewis, etc. But I should say that none could match the boldness of his expression, or the intensity of his compassion. So, these are the great poets who represented war through their poetry. And in the beginning of the lecture itself, I said that the poetry was the only form which gave expression to the reality of war. So it is said that the Great War period is actually remembered not through films or novels but by war poetry of trench poets. So, had this Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg survived the war, so they didn't actually survive the war, had they survived the war, the poetry of the coming period might have been different. They would actually have altered the predominance of Eliot and Ezra Pound had they lived. So they couldn't live longer to dominate these poets. So Eliot, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound are the greatest poets of the 20th century. So had these people lived, they would have altered the history, the literary history forever. So it is said that war actually killed their spirit of patriotism. But war actually killed their spirit of patriotism. But they made they made people realize the cruelties of war through their poetry. So when you come to modernist poets, war actually slips away from the work. It doesn't get any kind of an expression in their poets. War slipped away from the works of modernist poets. And but we should say, to conclude, we should say that war poetry actually prepared the way for change, preparing an audience for modernist movement. So, this is war poetry. So, we were discussing war poetry. The first phase, we had all those idealistic imagination, romantic conception about war, which is not at all connected with the reality of war. So, Rupert Brooke belonged to the first group. And then comes the real poetry regarding which narrated the horrors of war, starting from Siegfried Sassoon. There is Isaac Rosenberg, and of course the great Wilfred Owen. So this is war poetry for you. I'm stopping my lecture here. Hope you understood all these things. So I will make this PPT available for you. Please go through the notes. I will give you all those lecture notes to you. So please go through these notes. Please compile all these things. So please make it a point to combine all these things to prepare notes for yourself. So thank you, girls. Have a nice day.